She was traded for a whiskey debt in a lawless boomtown, left to freeze in the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. But when an abandoned mail-order bride stumbles upon a dying mountain man, her desperate act of mercy sparks a dangerous romance that will set the entire western frontier ablaze. The Union Pacific locomotive hissed and spat thick black smoke as it groaned to a halt at Bitter Creek Station, Wyoming Territory. It was November of 1874, and the biting wind that whipped across the desolate plains was a harsh welcome for Miss Josephine Miller. Clutching her worn leather valise, she stepped down onto the muddy platform, her sensible Philadelphia wool coat feeling pitifully thin against the frontier chill. Josie was 24, an orphan, and until 3 weeks ago, a seamstress barely scraping by in a cramped city tenement. Her salvation had come in the form of letters beautifully penned, poetic letters from a man named Silas Caldwell. Silas had described his sprawling cattle ranch, his gentle nature, and his deep, aching need for a devoted wife to share his prosperity. He had sent her a train ticket and a promise of a better life. But as the train blew its whistle and chugged away, leaving Josie in the shadow of a dilapidated station house, the prosperous rancher was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the platform was occupied by drifters, hardened miners, and men with sidearms strapped low on their hips. "You, the mail-order bride?" a gravelly voice asked. Josie turned to see a man leaning against a wooden post. He was nothing like the tin-type photograph Silas had sent. This man was gaunt, his clothes unwashed and reeking of stale whiskey and sour sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, darting nervously around the station. "I am Josephine Miller," she said, lifting her chin, trying to mask the sudden, icy dread pooling in her stomach. "I am looking for Mr. Silas Caldwell." "That's me," he muttered, scratching his patchy beard. He didn't offer to take her bag. "Ain't exactly what I pictured, but you'll do. Come on." There was no warm embrace, no mention of the ranch. Silas walked with a hurried, limping gait toward the center of Bitter Creek, a miserable collection of canvas tents and false-front wooden buildings. Mud sucked at Josie's boots as she struggled to keep up. "Mr. Caldwell, where is your wagon?" she asked, her breath misting in the freezing air. "And the ranch you spoke of?" "Change of plans," Silas grunted, glancing over his shoulder. "Had a rough patch. Lost some head of cattle to the winter. We're staying in town for a bit." He led her into the Rusty Spur, a saloon that smelled violently of cheap tobacco, spilled beer, and unwashed bodies. The piano player in the corner didn't stop pounding out a discordant tune as they entered. Silas dragged her toward a dark corner booth where a massive, terrifyingly ugly man sat chewing on a wet cigar. The man had a deep scar running from his ear to his collarbone, and the silver star pinned to his leather vest was a mockery of the law. This was Jebediah Bull Stanton, a known rustler and the unofficial tyrant of Bitter Creek. "Silas," Stanton rumbled, his dark eyes sliding over Josie with a predatory gleam. "You're late, and you owe me $500. "I don't got the cash, Bull," Silas stammered, his bravado entirely evaporating. He shoved his hand into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "But I got something better. I got the deed to her." Josie's heart stopped. "What?" Silas slammed their marriage contract signed by proxy in Pennsylvania onto the sticky table. "She's a hard worker. Sews, cooks, young enough. She's yours, Bull. We're square." "Silas." "No," Josie gasped, stepping back, the sheer horror of the betrayal washing over her. "You cannot do this. I am a human being, not a sack of flour." Stanton picked up the paper, laughing a slow, rumbling laugh. "Well now, Caldwell, she's got fire. I reckon I can get $500 worth of work out of her at the brothel upstairs." "Deal." Before Josie could scream, Silas bolted, He shoved past a saloon girl and sprinted out the swinging doors, disappearing into the Wyoming dusk. He had lured her across the country simply to pay off a gambling debt. "Come here, little bird," Stanton sneered, reaching a massive, filthy hand across the table to grab her wrist. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. Josie didn't scream. Instead, she grabbed the heavy glass oil lantern sitting in the center of the table and smashed it directly into Stanton's face. The glass shattered. The oil ignited instantly, catching Stanton's beard and shirt on fire. He roared in agony, falling backward and knocking over the heavy oak table. The saloon erupted into chaos. Men shouted. Horses outside whinnied in panic, and the piano music abruptly ceased. Josie didn't look back. She hiked up her heavy wool skirts and ran. She burst through the back doors of the saloon, sprinting past the outhouses and into the dark, frozen expanse beyond the town limits. She had no food, no horse, and no survival skills. But she knew one thing. Staying in Bitter Creek was a fate worse than freezing to death. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. Behind her, the glow of the saloon faded, but the shouting of Stanton's men echoed on the wind. They were coming for her. As the first heavy flakes of a deadly Wyoming blizzard began to fall, Josie plunged deeper into the treacherous foothills of the Wind River Range. The blizzard struck with a vengeance, a blinding wall of white that erased the world. Josie staggered through knee-deep drifts, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they might shatter. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through her thin Philadelphia coat and freezing the tears to her cheeks. She had been walking for what felt like hours, or perhaps days. Time had lost all meaning in the whiteout. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed against the rough bark of a massive pine tree, the snow instantly beginning to bury her. She closed her eyes. So this is how it ends, she thought, a strange, sleepy warmth beginning to spread through her freezing limbs. Abandoned by a coward, hunted by a monster, and claimed by the winter. But as the wind shifted, she caught a scent. It was faint, almost imperceptible, beneath the smell of pine and ice. Wood smoke. Josie's eyes snapped open. Adrenaline, scraped from the very bottom of her reserves, forced her to her feet. She pushed through the dense thicket of frosted evergreens, following the scent. Suddenly, the trees parted to reveal a small, sturdy log cabin built directly into the side of a rocky outcropping. No light shone from the windows, but a thin, grey ribbon of smoke was indeed curling from the stone chimney. "Hello?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper against the gale. She stumbled toward the heavy oak door and pushed. It gave way. Unlatched, Josie fell over the threshold, tumbling onto a rough-hewn wooden floor. The sudden contrast of the cabin's relative warmth made her skin burn. But the relief was instantly shattered by the metallic click of a revolver hammer being cocked. "Give me one good reason not to put a bullet between your eyes, O'Driscoll." A voice rasped from the shadows. It was a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together, thick with pain. Josie froze, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the dying hearth. Sprawled on a bearskin rug near the fire was a man. And not just a man, a giant. He was dressed in fringed buckskins, his broad shoulders and thick, dark hair, making him look wilder than the frontier itself. But the giant was fallen. His right hand leveled a massive Colt, 45 at her head. Trembling violently, his left hand was pressed desperately against his side, where the buckskin was soaked in a spreading, slick pool of dark crimson blood. I am not an O'Driscoll," Josie stammered, raising her empty hands, terrified by the sheer size of him and the feral glint in his feverish eyes. "I am Josephine. Please, I am freezing." The mountain man stared at her, his vision clearly swimming. His rugged face was pale beneath a layer of dirt and weather-beaten tan. He lowered the gun an inch, coughing wetly. "You ain't one of Stanton's boys. Stanton is the man I am running from," she whispered. A grim, blood-stained smile ghosted across the mountain man's lips. "Then we got something in common." His eyes rolled back in his head. The heavy revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards, and his massive frame went entirely limp. Josie scrambled away, pressing her back against the door. She waited for him to move, but he was as still as a corpse. Slowly, her fear of the man was replaced by the realization of her grim reality. She was alone in a cabin with a dying stranger. She could leave him to die, take his food, his fire, and wait out the storm. It was what Silas would have done. It was what the West taught you to do. But Josie Miller was her father's daughter. Dr. William Miller had been a battlefield surgeon at Gettysburg. And, before the cholera took him in Philadelphia, he had taught his daughter that a life was a life, no matter whose it was. She crawled toward the giant. Up close, the damage was horrific. He had been shot at close range. The bullet had entered just below his ribs on the right side. Stanton's men, the rustlers, they must have ambushed him in the woods. "All right, Mr. Mountain Man," she muttered, her hands shaking as she unbuttoned her freezing, wet coat and tossed it aside. "Don't you dare die on me." She sprang into action. First, she threw 3 thick logs onto the dying embers, coaxing the fire into a roaring blaze to bring light and heat to the cabin. Next, she scoured his shelves. She found a tin basin, a large jug of harsh rye whiskey, clean rags, and a hunting knife. In a small wooden box near his cot, she struck gold, a needle and coarse catgut thread. She hauled a bucket of melted snow, water over the fire to boil, then returned to the man. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Using his hunting knife, she carefully sliced away the blood-soaked buckskin shirt, exposing a chest corded with thick muscle, marred by old scars from bear claws and hunting knives. But the fresh gunshot wound was the crisis. Josie poured the raw whiskey directly into the wound. The mountain man's eyes flew open. He roared a sound so loud and primal it shook the dust from the rafters. His massive hand shot out, wrapping around Josie's throat with terrifying, unyielding strength. He was completely delirious, fighting a phantom enemy. "No!" Josie gasped, clawing at his thick wrist, her airway crushing. "I am helping you. Let go!" He blinked, staring at her through a haze of agony and fever. For a fraction of a second, his wild eyes focused on her terrified face. The grip loosened. He gasped for air, his head falling back against the rug as he slipped back into unconsciousness. Josie collapsed back on her heels, gasping for breath, rubbing her bruised throat. Tears of terror pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. She couldn't stop now. She retrieved her metal sewing thimble from her valise. Boiling her hands and the hunting knife in the hot water, she gritted her teeth and went to work. The bullet was lodged deep against the muscle. It took 10 agonizing minutes of probing into the torn flesh, with the man groaning and shifting blindly beneath her hands, before the tip of the blade caught lead. With a sickening pop, she popped the deformed bullet out onto the wooden floor. Josie didn't waste a second. She grabbed the needle and catgut, threading it with trembling, blood-slicked fingers. "Forgive me," she whispered to the unconscious man, and began to stitch the torn flesh together, sealing the wound as tight as her seamstress skills allowed. By the time she finished wrapping his torso in clean, tight bandages, the sun was beginning to rise behind the blizzard, casting a pale, ghostly light through the cabin window. Josie was covered in his blood, utterly exhausted, her hands aching. She managed to drag several heavy wool blankets from his bed and covered his shivering, massive frame. She sat on the floor beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. For now. Josie leaned her head against the rough stone of the fireplace, the adrenaline finally leaving her body. The abandoned mail-order bride had survived the night, and she had saved the mountain man. But as she drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, she had no idea that Jeremiah Grizzly Hayes was not a man who ever left a debt unpaid, and that Stanton's men were already tracking her footprints in the snow. The smell of roasted chicory and burning pine dragged Jeremiah Hayes from the suffocating depths of a fever dream. He opened his eyes, the heavy lids feeling like they were coated in sand. The searing pain in his right side was still there, but the blinding, white-hot agony of the bullet had faded to a dull, throbbing ache. He tried to sit up and immediately groaned, his hand instinctively flying to his ribs. Instead of crusted blood and open flesh, his fingers brushed against tight, neat bandages. "I wouldn't move if I were you, Mr. Hayes." Jeremiah turned his head, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt that was no longer on the floor. Sitting in his worn rocking chair near the hearth was the woman from the night before. She looked exhausted, her dark hair falling out of its pins, dark circles bruising the skin beneath her eyes. Her delicate hands were stained with dried blood. His blood. "You dug the lead out," he rasped, his voice sounding like a rusty saw blade. He glanced at his own skin, noticing the intricate, perfectly spaced stitches holding his flesh together. "Ain't never seen sewing like that on a man. I was a seamstress in Philadelphia," Josie said quietly, offering him a tin cup of steaming chicory coffee. "It was either sew you up or watch you bleed out onto your lovely bear rug. I chose the former." Jeremiah took the cup, his massive, calloused fingers dwarfing the tin. He studied her over the rim. "Most folks would have taken my rifle, my horse, and left me for the buzzards. Why didn't you?" "Because I am not like the men in this God-forsaken territory," Josie replied, her voice hardening with sudden, fierce defiance. "I am Josie Miller, and the man who brought me here, Silas Caldwell, traded me to a monster named Jebediah Stanton to pay a gambling debt. I ran. I found your cabin. That is the truth." Jeremiah's eyes darkened at the mention of Stanton. He took a slow, painful sip of the bitter coffee. "Stanton, Bull Stanton. That explains the fire in your eyes, Miss Miller. Stanton's men are the ones who put this hole in my side. I refused to let them run their stolen cattle through my valley. They ambushed me by the ridge." He set the cup down and forced himself to sit upright, gritting his teeth against the searing pain. He reached under his mattress and pulled out a lever-action Winchester rifle. "If you ran from Stanton and you left tracks before the snow dumped, they're coming. Bull don't let property go. They couldn't possibly track me in this blizzard," Josie protested, though a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. "The storm broke an hour ago." Jeremiah pointed to the window. The howling wind had indeed died down, replaced by an eerie, dead silence. Sunlight glared off the fresh snow. "And Stanton employs a tracker named Silas. If Silas is the one who sold you, he knows exactly what kind of boots you're wearing and how far you can run." Before Josie could process the horror of Silas actively hunting her, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a dry twig snapping echoed through the crisp mountain air outside. Jeremiah's demeanor instantly shifted. The injured, groggy man vanished, replaced by a deadly predator. He cocked the Winchester, the metallic clack sounding loud in the small cabin. "Get down," he ordered in a harsh whisper, behind the cast-iron stove. Now. Josie scrambled across the floor just as the front window shattered. A barrage of bullets tore through the cabin, sending splinters of wood and glass flying. The stew pot on the hearth exploded, hissing loudly as water doused the edge of the fire. "Grizzly Hayes," a sneering voice shouted from the tree line. "We know you're in there. And we know you got Bull's new bride. Send her out, and we might just let you die of that gut wound in peace." Jeremiah dragged himself to the shattered window, using the heavy log frame for cover. "Come and take her! Hiram!" he bellowed back. He hoisted the heavy rifle to his shoulder. He didn't aim for long. He fired once. A scream echoed from the pines, followed by the sound of a heavy body hitting the snow. "Damn it! He's still got fight," another voice yelled. Gunfire erupted again, chewing through the sturdy pine logs of the cabin. Josie huddled behind the stove, terrified, but refusing to be useless. She crawled toward the center of the room, grabbed Jeremiah's fallen Colt, .45, and a heavy leather bandolier of ammunition, and slid back to his side. Jeremiah glanced at her, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his hardened features. "Load the Colt," he grunted, firing twice more out the window. "They're trying to flank us on the west side." Josie's hands shook, but she remembered her father showing her how to load a pistol during the draft riots years ago. She slid the heavy brass cartridges into the cylinder, snapping it shut and handing it to him. Jeremiah took it, his giant hand covering hers for a brief second. His skin was rough, but surprisingly warm. "I won't let them take you, Josie," he said, his voice low and fiercely protective. "You saved my life. I repay my debts." He leaned out and unleashed a volley of fire from the revolver, pinning the attackers behind the snow-draped boulders. He was an incredibly lethal marksman, firing with a cold, calculated precision that kept Stanton's men completely at bay. After 10 minutes of deafening gunfire, the shooting from the trees abruptly stopped. "They're falling back," Jeremiah panted, leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale and slick with fresh sweat. A small spot of red was beginning to blossom through his bandages. There were only 3 of them. A scouting party. "They're heading back to Bitter Creek to get Stanton and the rest of his gang." "We won?" Josie asked, her voice trembling. "No," Jeremiah said grimly, using the rifle as a crutch to stand. "We just bought ourselves a head start. Pack your bags, Miss Miller. We're leaving." Leaving the sanctuary of the cabin felt like stepping onto the surface of a frozen alien world. The snow was blindingly bright, and the cold was a physical weight pressing against Josie's chest. Jeremiah had saddled his massive black draft cross, a beast he called Goliath. Out in the lean-to barn, he wrapped Josie in a heavy buffalo hide coat that dwarfed her completely and handed her a pair of thick, fur-lined mittens. "Keep your face covered," he instructed, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Frostbite'll take your nose before you even feel it." He hauled himself up into the saddle, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as his torn side protested. He reached down a massive hand. Josie took it, and with effortless strength, he hoisted her up behind him. "Hold tight," he rumbled. Josie wrapped her arms around his broad waist, pressing her face against the thick buckskin of his coat. He smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something uniquely masculine and earthy. Despite the terror of their flight, being pressed against his solid warmth made her feel an alien sense of absolute safety. They rode higher into the Wind River Range, ascending toward the treacherous passes of the Bitterroot Mountains. Jeremiah avoided the established trails, navigating a maze of frozen streams and sheer granite cliffs that only a seasoned mountain man could read. The journey was punishing. Every step the horse took jarred Jeremiah's wound, but he never complained. He rode with a stoic, iron-willed endurance that left Josie in awe. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, the temperature plummeted drastically. "We can't go further in the dark," Jeremiah called back over the howling wind. "There's an old abandoned silver mine up ahead. The Lucky Strike belonged to a prospector named Josiah Hollister before a cave-in took him. We'll shelter there." They reached the mine entrance just as darkness fully consumed the mountains. It was a gaping black maw in the side of a cliff, braced with heavy, rotting timbers. Jeremiah led Goliath inside, the darkness engulfing them. He struck a match, illuminating the rough-hewn stone walls and a small, dry alcove that miners had once used for sleeping. He built a small, smokeless fire using dry scrub brush he'd gathered along the way, keeping it deep enough inside the tunnel so the light wouldn't be seen from the outside. Josie helped him off the horse. He was leaning heavily now, his strength finally waning. She guided him to sit on a pile of old, dry canvas sacks. "Let me see the wound," she demanded softly, slipping off her heavy mittens. Jeremiah didn't argue. He opened his coat and lifted his shirt. The bandages were soaked through with fresh blood. The jarring ride had torn a few of her stitches. Josie felt a lump form in her throat. He was destroying himself to keep her safe. "I have to clean it and re-stitch the torn ones," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's going to hurt. I've had worse," he muttered, watching her face in the flickering firelight. As she worked, cleaning the wound with melted snow and applying fresh, tight bindings, the silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken emotion. The harshness of the frontier, the brutality of the men they were fleeing, all faded away in the warm golden glow of the small fire. "You didn't have to bring me," Josie whispered. Her eyes focused on her task. "You could have hidden. You are injured because of me." Jeremiah reached out, his massive fingers gently catching her chin and tilting her face up to meet his gaze. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers. "I've lived up in these mountains alone for 5 years, Josie," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated in his chest. "Left Texas after the war. Saw too much killing. Decided I was done with people. Figured the world was just full of men like Stanton." He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his touch impossibly gentle for a man of his size. "But then you came along, stitched up a dying stranger, stood your ground with a Colt in your hand. You showed me there's still something worth fighting for down there." Josie's breath hitched. She looked into his eyes and saw no deceit, no cowardice, no hidden agenda, none of the things she had seen in Silas Caldwell. She saw only raw, unfiltered honesty. "Stanton will not stop," she whispered, a tear escaping and tracking a clean line down her soot-stained cheek. "Let him come," Jeremiah replied, his jaw setting in a rigid, defiant line. "Let him bring his rustlers, and let him bring that coward Silas. I swear to you on my life, Josie Miller, they will not touch a single hair on your head. You are under my protection now." The way he said it wasn't a boast, it was a vow. An ironclad oath sworn in the depths of a frozen mountain. Josie leaned forward, acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed, and gently pressed her lips to his cheek, right over the rough stubble of his beard. Jeremiah went completely still, his breath catching in his chest. Slowly, he wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. Outside the mine, the Wyoming winter howled its fury. But inside, wrapped in the arms of the grizzly mountain man, the abandoned mail-order bride finally felt like she was home. But the peace was a fleeting illusion. Miles below, at the base of the mountain, a line of 20 torches burned bright against the snow. Jebediah Stanton sat atop a massive bay stallion, staring up at the peaks. Next to him, trembling in his saddle, was Silas Caldwell, a map of the mining trails clutched in his cowardly hands. The hunt was far from over. It was just beginning. Dawn broke over the bitter roots, not with the warmth of the sun, but with a frigid, iron-grey light that seeped into the mouth of the Lucky Strike mine. Josie awoke to the terrifying sound of echoing hooves and the crunch of heavy boots on packed snow. Jeremiah was already awake, positioned near the tunnel entrance. He had stripped off his heavy buffalo coat to allow for free movement, his Winchester rifle resting steadily against a decaying timber. "They're here," he whispered, his voice dangerously calm. 20 men. Stanton is leading them up the ridge. Josie scrambled to his side, peering into the gloom. Down the snowy incline, a line of armed riders formed a lethal half-circle around the mine's entrance. In the center sat Jebediah Bull Stanton, his face wrapped in a dirty scarf to protect the burn scars Josie had given him. Beside him, trembling violently on a scrawny roan horse, was Silas Caldwell. "Grizzly Hayes!" Stanton's booming voice echoed off the granite cliffs, dripping with malice. "I know you're in that hole. I ain't leaving without my property. And now I'm taking your scalp as interest. Send the girl out, and I'll let you bleed to death in the dark. Keep her, and my boys will smoke you out like a badger." Jeremiah didn't flinch. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a heavy canvas sack he had recovered from the depths of the mine during the night. It smelled strongly of sulfur and charcoal, old blasting powder. "Josie," Jeremiah said softly, not taking his eyes off the men below. "When I tell you to run, you run deep into the main shaft. Take the lantern. Do not look back." "No," she said fiercely, grabbing his arm. "I am not leaving you to face them alone. You won't be." "I'm just setting the welcome mat," he replied, a grim, deadly smile touching his lips. He poured a thick trail of the black powder across the tunnel entrance, leading it back behind a heavy pile of fallen rocks. Outside, Stanton lost his patience. "Silas, get in there and flush 'em out." "Me?" Silas squeaked, his eyes wide with terror. "Bull, you said, if I tracked her, my debt was clear. You said." Stanton drew his revolver in a blur and pressed the barrel directly against Silas's temple. "I said you'd live. Now, walk into that mine, or you die in the snow." Sobbing, Silas dismounted. He drew a small derringer, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He began to trudge up the snowy slope toward the black moor of the Lucky Strike. Behind him, Stanton signaled 5 of his heavily armed rustlers to follow closely. As Silas stepped into the gloomy entrance, his eyes struggled to adjust. "Josie?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Josie, please, just come out. They're gonna kill me." "You killed yourself the moment you sold me, Silas." Josie's voice echoed from the darkness, cold and unrelenting. "Light it," Jeremiah whispered. Josie struck a match and touched it to the end of the powder trail. The black powder hissed, sparking violently as the flame raced toward the entrance. Silas saw the sparks and screamed, turning to run. He crashed into the rustlers behind him. A split second later, the flame reached the massive canvas sack of blasting powder Jeremiah had wedged against the decaying support timbers at the tunnel's mouth. The explosion was deafening. A massive fireball erupted from the mine entrance, hurling Silas and the vanguard of rustlers backward into the snow like broken dolls. The concussive shockwave shook the very foundation of the mountain. With a terrifying groan, the rotting timbers gave way, and tons of granite and snow collapsed, completely sealing the entrance of the Lucky Strike in a choking cloud of dust and debris. Inside, Jeremiah had tackled Josie behind the rock pile, shielding her with his massive body as debris rained down around them. The roar faded into a ringing silence, replaced by the sound of coughing. "Are you hurt?" Jeremiah asked, his hands frantically checking her shoulders in the pitch black. "I'm whole," she choked out, waving the dust away. They had survived the blast, but they were sealed inside. However, Jeremiah knew mountains. Josiah Hollister didn't just dig one hole, he grunted, striking a fresh match and lighting their lantern. "There's an air shaft at the back of this vein. It leads up to the ridge. Come on." They navigated the treacherous, winding tunnels for an hour, the air growing colder and fresher until they saw a sliver of pale daylight. They squeezed through the narrow, natural fissure, emerging onto a high, snowy plateau overlooking the valley. But as they pulled themselves out of the rock, a massive shadow fell over them. Jebediah Stanton stood there, panting heavily. his clothes torn and covered in rock dust. He had survived the avalanche, riding his horse up the back trail when he realized the entrance was blown. His dark eyes burned with a maniacal, murderous rage. He held a massive hunting knife in his right hand. "You cost me half my men." "Hayes?" Stanton roared, lunging forward with terrifying speed. Jeremiah didn't have time to raise his rifle. He tackled Stanton, sending both men crashing into the deep snow. It was a brutal, primal clash of titans. Stanton drove his knee directly into Jeremiah's fresh bullet wound. Jeremiah roared in agony, his vision going white, but he refused to let go. He clamped his massive hands around Stanton's thick neck, squeezing with the desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength of a grizzly defending its mate. Stanton slashed wildly with the knife, tearing through Jeremiah's buckskin and slicing a deep gash across his shoulder. Jeremiah faltered, his strength draining as blood poured from his new wound. Stanton raised the knife for a final, lethal plunge into Jeremiah's chest. Bang! Stanton froze. The hunting knife dropped from his hand. He looked down at his chest, where a dark crimson stain was rapidly blooming. He slowly turned his head. Josie stood 10 feet away, her hands gripping Jeremiah's smoking Colt. 45, her stance wide and perfectly steady. Her face was pale, but her eyes were like polished steel. Stanton swayed, coughing a spray of blood, and collapsed backward into the snow, dead before his massive body settled. Jeremiah rolled over, gasping for air, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Josie dropped the heavy revolver and fell to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face against his chest as the adrenaline finally gave way to tears. "It's over," Jeremiah breathed, wrapping his good arm around her waist, holding her tighter than life itself. "It's over, Josie." By the spring of 1875, the Wyoming snow had melted, giving way to an ocean of vibrant green buffalo grass and blooming lupine in the Wind River Valley. The legend of the abandoned bride and the mountain man who slaughtered Stanton's gang had spread across the territory, keeping rustlers and outlaws far away from the valley out of sheer terror. As for Silas Caldwell, his body was never found in the spring thaw. The frontier had simply swallowed the coward whole. On a bright, sun-drenched morning, Josie stepped out onto the porch of a beautifully crafted, newly expanded log cabin. She wore a simple calico dress, her dark hair shining in the sunlight. She walked down the steps and handed a tin of fresh water to a massive man chopping firewood. Jeremiah wiped the sweat from his brow, dropping the heavy axe. His scars had healed, leaving him looking more rugged, yet infinitely softer when his eyes met hers. He pulled his wife into his arms, kissing her deeply beneath the endless, azure sky of the untamed West. The abandoned bride hadn't just survived the frontier, she had conquered it, forging a love as deep and unyielding as the mountains themselves. What a breathtaking tale of survival, betrayal, and untamed frontier love. Josie and Jeremiah proved that even in the harshest wilderness, a true bond can conquer the darkest of evils. Did you love this Wild West romance? Hit that like button, share this gripping story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical sagas. Tell us in the comments what you'd do in Josie's shoes.